This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. This week, I'm talking to returning guest Victoria Bennett, author and now proud Orcadian, about her journey from the Eden Valley in Cumbria to the windswept islands of Orkney. We chat about the joys and challenges of starting a new garden from scratch in such a unique and dramatic climate. And Victoria shares her inspiring vision for building a community apothecary space rooted in creativity, care, and a deeper connection to the land.
We were living in Cumbria, where we'd been living for 26 years, I think, at that point. So a long time. And at the time we were living in the Eden Valley, which we'd been in our home for 10 years at that point. So it was a big move.
Yeah.
But it was a big move that happened very suddenly and also seemed to be very slow, because I'd sort of fallen in love with Orkney. You'll hear a lot of people say that. It's like, oh, well, I fell in love with it, this time or that time. So people generally have like a long history with Orkney, kind of a long relationship. So I had applied for a job many years before my son had been born, and I hadn't got it, but I'd kind of got really interested in the place and read loads about it and sort of fallen in love with it through poetry and art and images of it and stories from it and the history of it. And that sort of secret romance went on for quite a few years. Initially, I sort of had fantasies of moving here, but that wasn't possible because of circumstances in life, with grief and my son being born. And sort of generally being needed. So there was a lot of care duties, caregiving. But we returned here sort of on to visit a few times over sort of 14 years that followed, which each time I came, it sort of felt like a place where I needed to be. And that the reasons for that changed over the years. So initially, it felt like it was a place where I could sort of be for grief, to express my grief in the landscape, and that changed over the years, but sort of that connection with the place never left. And then we reached a point when my son was 14, and we, for the first time in our lives, we were in a situation where we would be able to buy a house. Well, we had enough to put a small deposit down, and my son was he was coming up from, he was 14, and we just thought, he's going to leave home soon. That's sort of how I felt. Blink and he'll be gone. And we wanted to have an adventure with him before he left, but also I didn't want to leave it. So we left and we moved home after he'd left home. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to kind of make a home together before he did that. And so we kind of thought about it, and I said to my husband, I've always wanted to move to Orkney, and I can't really explain why. I just have always wanted to do it, and it feels like the right place to do. We asked our son, and luckily they both said they agreed. And I'd sort of built friendships over time up here. I'd been working with an artist who lived up here during the pandemic. We've been working together online, and she told me that a house had come available. So we got in the car, we drove all the way up, it's sort of 500 miles, got on the ferry, came over, had some lunch, looked at the house, got back on the ferry, drove back down and put an offer on the house.
Wow.
And within 2 months, we'd moved.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, had you visited much beforehand?
We'd visited 3 times in total over the 14 years, sort of to Orkney, and that's to all of, different places. We'd been to this village once. So, yeah, we had been here, and I had a kind of small collection of things that were from Orkney. So I kind of had pottery and photographs and maps and things like that. So I kind of had all of these sort of little secret love letters from Orkney that I'd been collecting over the years.
I tend to think that everybody's fairly equal, but I do think sometimes women get a bit of a tough rap when it comes to the caregiving. And I know that you alluded to your father in the book, and you don't have to go into this if you don't want to, but I think sometimes, like you said, you were dealing with grief, you've been dealing with care duties, and there never really is a right time. You just sometimes have to bite the bullet and go for it, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I had been, obviously, my sister drowned shortly before my son was born, so I was kind of grieving from day one of his life, and also, that meant that the relationships within my family changed, and I was giving a lot of support to my mum, and then my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 2, so that changed my role again with motherhood. Obviously I was already his caring for him as a mother, but then I became a parent caregiver. So that was very full time. And then shortly after that, when my son was 5, I think, my mum became ill, and then she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. So I became her full-time carer, and we actually moved in with my parents in the last year of my mother's life. So I was looking after my young son full-time. I was looking after my mother full-time, and my mother had been my father's caregiver because he had had a stroke and had mobility issues and is deaf. So I was looking after him as well. And then after my mother died, I kind of continued to look after my father. Now, I didn't live at home with him, but we were just down the road, so that was a daily caregiving. And I kind of got to this point where, like I said, where my son was 14, and he no longer needed me in that same way as a young child needs, but caregiving never stops when there's medical stuff going on. But I realized that I had been a caregiver for others for most of his life. I'd shared that, through his childhood. He'd always known me to be a caregiver and had accompanied me in that caregiving. And I thought, well, I'd like to have a bit of time with him before he leaves home, where it's not caregiving for others, but also there was a bit of space for me. So there's a lot of noise in the head when doing full-time care. And when that kind of lessens a bit, there's a bit more space, I suppose, to think about what I needed and how I needed to care for myself. But obviously, there's a bit of a kickback there. I mean, I say we moved very quickly, but I didn't just turn around and say, "Oh, we're moving," to my father. When we decided we were going to look for a house, I did talk to him, and I said we were going to look at Orkney, and how do you feel about that? And I talked to my other siblings, and everybody was supportive. Obviously, my father was going to miss us, and it was a big change, but he was supportive of it. He'd always done what he wanted to do in life, and my mother, before she died, had told us to kind of have an adventure together, and so he knew it was an important move and supported us in that. But other people didn't necessarily see it as a positive thing, and I got a little bit of kickback from people who'd sort of previously said what a good person I was for looking after my parents. So I'm kind of raising an eyebrow and going, "You're doing what? How could you leave your father?" So that was an interesting experience.
Yeah, I bet. Yes, I sort of do understand that guilt and that pressure, but it's so important to make the space, and then out of the space comes things like your writing. So, it's so important. But thinking about the garden, because your previous book, your garden was kind of a main character, and you spent a lot of love and care on that garden. So was that a wrench, leaving that behind to kind of go and start with this new blank canvas?
It was. I mean, obviously, that we'd been there 10 years, and we'd grown this garden from the rubble, literally. And by the time it came to move, that was an amazing space. It was still very much disapproved of, I think, being a very wild garden, but it was an amazingly biodiverse space. But because we were in social housing, there's a requirement that the garden, as well as the house, is returned to its original state. So when they came to inspect the house, we were also told that we had to remove most of the garden, which was really difficult. So we had to fill in the ponds, and we had to dig out the beds, and we had to take down the larger trees. And, so pretty much everything that we had grown over the years, we were told to get rid of. So what we did is we potted up what we could, bits of the garden that we could pot up, my habit of transporting weeds across large distances. So we did that, and I gathered as many seeds as I could because it was in the autumn, sort of late summer, autumn. So my son and I gathered seeds, and we took an inventory to sort of see how much wildlife was in it. And it went over 5 pages of A4 and kept going. So that was kind of evidence that we'd taken this place that was very monospecies, kind of very desert-like. It was just rubble and, newly sown grass, and turned it into this really thriving biodiverse space that provided both food and herbal plants for us, for our well-being, and also habitats for all the wildlife. But I also knew sort of secretly, even though we had to kind of get rid of this garden, I kind of knew that it would come back because it was in the autumn, so it looked a lot more sparse than I knew would happen the next year. So I was kind of aware that there were bulbs in there and seeds, and so that helped. But I think you have to be willing to let go of things, and we were leaving behind so much of our lives and so much of who we were, and so maybe it was also an important thing to do, I think, at this juncture, both in my son's life, where he was moving from kind of those childhood years into teenage, and also in my life, where I was moving into, I was in my 50s and moving into a new stage of my life. So maybe that was also important to leave behind that place and to go somewhere new and to start this new chapter of our lives. So that helped, I think. I still miss it.
I bet you do. And it's when you write about that aspect of having to kind of put it back to how it was, and you realise how tricky it is to garden when you don't own a patch of land and you don't have the agency to do what you want with it. But presumably now you've got your new garden, the sky's the limit. I'm hoping you can do what you like with it.
It's an amazing feeling. We still kind of can't quite believe that we bought a house and that I have, there's that Virginia Woolf, a room of one's own, but it's not, it's a garden of one's own. It's tiny. Our garden's tiny, tiny. I mean, our last garden wasn't massive, but this one is tiny. So the sky's the limit, but space is, honestly, there's no room to move in the garden now. I've put too much in it. But it was wonderful. I mean, when we moved here, there wasn't really anything in it. There were a few overgrown plants, hebe, an old rose bush, goat willow, lots of dandelions, a lot of cat crap. It was obviously the neighbourhood public toilet for the cats. And at the time, there were 13 cats living around us.
Wow.
I love cats, so I don't mind too much. But it was a blank space, and we came in November. We moved in November, so, there's nothing really to do. I felt really uprooted. We'd made a choice that it wasn't a crisis move. It was a really positive move of trust and hope. We weren't running away from anything, but it was still a massive move, and everything felt very strange. So I kind of had that winter to just sit with the space and kind of wander around locally and get my bearings and my roots with where I was, and kind of start doodling what I wanted in the garden, and that was really fun to kind of feel like there would be nobody telling me I could or couldn't do something. But then it was also lovely because I received such positive sort of support from people around here as I started to do the garden as well. So instead of, I was still looking over my shoulder expecting somebody to tell me off.
Yeah, but it's great that, you've got that support, and I believe that you've made a connection with someone locally as well. Well, we might get onto that later on, I don't know. But how is gardening in Orkney on a practical level? I mean, I'm guessing it's a totally different ballgame.
It is a totally different ballgame. I'm still learning. Well, for starters, what I discovered is there's not really the same seasons. I would define Orkney seasons as being there's a dark season and a light season, and then there's 2 storm seasons in between. So there's a very short growing time, but it's very intense. So the first thing I discovered was I was kind of waiting. It's like, when's spring going to come? When's spring going to come? When am I going to see all these signs of spring? And my signs of spring are kind of the hedgerows, turning into that kind of blousy white ball gown type thing that they did in Cumbria with the blossom and, sort of the songbirds and, the bulbs pushing through and it didn't happen here. So I was kind of like, where's spring? Because you don't really get that kind of blossomy hedgerows because there's, we get a lot of storms in the spring. So February and March are kind of the worst months of the year for storms. And that really lasts right the way through until March is gone. So we don't get that kind of early, there are daffodils, there are crocus, it's all of these things, but my God, are they hardy? They're kind of, I'm gonna hang on. And everything gets windburnt and blown off. But then kind of around May, so April, when everybody's going, oh, it's lovely, it's nearly summer. I'm kind of like, don't talk to me until May. Nothing's growing yet. But then May comes and the light has changed and we're kind of into that almost perpetual light that Orkney has. And suddenly everything grows. It's like everything is on steroids. Or it's all Japanese knotweed. It's that kind of level of growth. You kind of go to bed and you come back out and everything's a foot taller. I mean, not quite, but then you get this very intense growing season. I felt quite overwhelmed by it. I felt quite overwhelmed by the amount of light. Why will it get dark? There's a slight sort of mania that comes with it, but also quite overwhelmed with how fast and how abundantly everything grew. But then you see a storm can come, a summer storm, and that's it, wiped out. We had 2 summer storms last year, and you could literally see the path of the wind through the garden where it was just brown, windburnt, like autumn. And then also autumn, you don't have the kind of autumn colours in the trees. There are trees in Orkney. I'm going to dispute the fact that people say there are none. They aren't very big. They're a bit like the Shetland pony equivalent of trees. But they are here. But you don't get a changing kind of the leaf change because they're green, and then like the autumn storms hit, and they just kind of overnight shrivel up into this sort of what I call playgroup brown. It's kind of this uniform brown when all the colours get mixed together, when children are little and they make brown, and they all go that same colour, and then the leaves fall off. It's like, that's it.
Yeah.
That's autumn. So yeah, gardening in those circumstances is quite challenging. I've had to let go of some of my sort of beloved plants, like lavender. For the life of me, I'm still not managing to grow. I'm going to keep going. I'm determined. But then other things grow really well, like roseroot, which never did very well in Cumbria, grows really well here. And then I just find myself looking at different things to signify the seasons. So the light changes, and that's incredible. And the migrating birds. So, when you sort of notice that, spring is starting when the oyster catchers turn up, and and autumn's starting when this happens, and the seals have turned up, so we must be heading into winter. So it's kind of a different way of seeing things.
It does sound so different. And when I was reading the book, I thought, you must have had to sort of, as you say, let go of some of your old friends, but you found new ones. And I'm always interested in the plants that crop up in a place, not just because they're suited to the aspect there, but also because the people there find them useful. I mean, have you got a sense of that the plants are kind of there almost for a purpose, not just because they suit it, but because the people there can actually use them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why I love learning local names for plants, because I think that gives you kind of a way of understanding their identity, but also understanding how other people have used them through time. You've got the history of their relationship with people in the place, and we become part of that ongoing story. and how we use them. So, you've got sort of plants here that have got a long history of being used, but then you've also got plants that people are using very practically. So instead of hawthorn hedges, we have Rosa rugosa. So people plant that everywhere. So you've got these big rose hedges now instead, because it's fast growing, it's hardy. Yes, it can be classed as invasive, but here it's essential. It provides a windbreak, but also it provides lovely hips to use and rose petals. So it's kind of, it gives something back as well. Fuchsia as well, which grows a bit like in Ireland. It grows prolifically here. And I didn't realize till I moved here that fuchsia berries pretty much do the same thing as elderberries. So elder doesn't do as well, although it does grow. Elder, sort of quite often you don't get very many berries because the blossoms have blown off earlier. What berries are there are eaten by the birds. So, but fuchsia berries are sort of bountiful. So I've started using those in my personal remedy uses. So, I think if we learn what grows, and that's where I always start with growing garden, I look at what's growing around me, because I think that's kind of the biggest clue as to what environment I'm growing in. Because I'm not a trained horticulturalist, I generally kind of go with what I think is going to work by looking at what grows around me wild.
Yeah, what I liked as well in the book, that, thinking about the design side of it and how you go about establishing a garden, and it to me should be quite apparent, but really it wasn't. And I thought that's actually a very, very good point. When you start a garden, particularly if it's a herbalist garden or an apothecary garden, you should begin with a purpose. And I thought, yeah, that's a really clever idea. What was the purpose you sort of went for when you started to establish your space?
It's never going to be a massively sort of a produce-laden garden, for example, but I wanted it to be nurturing. I wanted it to be, I think, a haven for myself and for anyone or anything that visited it. I wanted it to support wildlife. I wanted it to support my well-being, and a lot of that was to do with kind of that transitioning time as well, that point of change. I wanted it to be a place that felt like it supported me through a time of change, and also kind of nurtured that beginning sense of reclaiming who I am and my creativity and my kind of centering myself as a person of my age now and to this sort of new point in my life. I looked at how to create that in the spaces. So obviously sort of haven for wildlife meant kind of plotting in sort of micro habitats, which, because of the size of the garden, really are micro habitats. So, I've got a tiny little barrel pond, which, had lots of froglets in last year, which was brilliant. I've got tiniest, what I would call sort of the woodland area, where there's a small elder and the goat willow. So it's very shady. So underneath there, I've got a little sort of mini dead hedge area, breaking down some logs. I've got wild garlic growing there and sort of woodland ground cover. And then kind of got other areas which are much more centered on scent, so roses, and I've got a herb. Originally, when I grew it, it was important for me to kind of have a sense of space. So I kind of looked at the circular motif that repeats itself in Orkney so often, sort of with the rings of Brodgar and Maze Howe and the cairns. You've got this kind of Neolithic and Iron Age circular motif. So I went for a circular path because that's a never-ending walk. In the centre of that, originally I had a kind of a micro meadow with wildflowers. I've now turned that into a more sort of specific herb spiral area with kind of my core apothecary plants in there. So it's kind of a little area to sit in. And so it's kind of like, it has to kind of serve all of these purposes in the same way that you would do with a really large garden, but just on a much smaller scale.
Yeah, I love it. So as I alluded to earlier, you, I think, have taken on slightly bigger space, potentially. So you don't need to go into that if you don't want to. And I don't know if it's linked, but I wondered kind of what's next for you and your garden.
Well, it's quite exciting. So in our first year, a very lovely gentleman who lives nearby offered me the use of his garden. He didn't garden it. His wife had been the gardener, but sadly she'd passed away. So it was very overgrown, but it was obviously loved at one point, and he said I could have that on loan. And that's very sheltered. It's next door to the community garden, which is great as well, because that's lovely. So actually, with my son, we're kind of very slowly growing a little woodland apothecary garden, which I know sounds like the most optimistic thing to do in Orkney. But, we bought up saplings that my son had planted after my mother had died, which we had been growing in pots. So we've planted a few of those. I mean, obviously it's not large enough to plant the trees that will become very large, like chestnuts, but we've put rowan and elder and willow, and we're growing a hedge along with a sort of hedgerow with hazel and blackthorn and hawthorn and wildflowers. Then in the centre of that, we've kind of got an opening that we've created with apothecary beds in. We've got sort of some raised vegetable beds and a wildflower area. So that's kind of very slowly, we're moving that towards that kind of garden. And then at the moment, I'm actually at the very early stages of trying to set up the Orkney Apothecary, which has kind of grown out of both my journey of gardening, of apothecary gardening, and also my more involved thing with creating teas and from those things. And I'm looking at developing a woman-led, sustainable, regenerative garden that, well, it'll start off with produce, but move towards a garden which will be growing apothecary and wildflowers, and sort of incorporate both the production of kind of teas and well-being products, but also creative learning and community learning alongside that on sort of biodiversity, sustainability and apothecary gardening. So that's kind of my long-term vision that's underway at the moment. Quite a big one.
You say, I don't think you're going to have much spare time on your hands.
No. But I mean, the intention is that it will be a community-supported space anyway. So if I can circle back momentarily to the idea of caregiving, I think we need to move much more towards an ecology of care sort of on this planet and in our lives. And I think part of that is caring for ourselves and caring for the land that we live on, caring for our communities. And for me, that space is about that. It's about that kind of reciprocal relationship with plants and with people, with myself, of caregiving. So I want to create, in my own garden, in this other woodland garden, and hopefully in the Orkney Apothecary, my aim really is to create those spaces, however large or small, that encourage that reciprocal relationship of care between ourselves and the planet that we live on, really.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Victoria for such a wonderful chat. If today's episode has got you thinking more deeply about the relationship between plants, healing and finding your way back to yourself, you might also enjoy episode 370, Remembering Our Nature, and episode 368, Rooted in Purpose. You'll find links to both in the show notes, and as always, thank you for listening. Next up is Benny with his Insect of the Week, but first a word from our sponsors at roastinghouse.co.uk.
There's nothing like a nice cup of coffee outside on a spring day. Hello from the Roasting House. We're a small, family-owned coffee roastery based in South Yorkshire. We love coffee, but we're also passionate about protecting nature and trying to keep our footprint as small as we can. At the Roasting House, we offer delicious coffees from around the world, carefully selected from farms that use nature-friendly methods such as shade growing, soil conservation, and maintaining wild areas for native wildlife. We roast in small batches using an energy-efficient roaster and filter the smoke to remove carbon to reduce air pollution. Roasting House coffee is packed in home compostable packaging, and we know that it actually breaks down because we've tested it in our own compost heap and worm farm. Order at roastinghouse.co.uk, and if you mention Roots and All or the Insect of the Week at checkout, we'll send you 25% extra free coffee as a thank you for supporting us.
The orange-tipped butterfly. Scientific name, Anthocharis cardomines. Now, today's Insect of the Week is a really special one, not just because it's beautiful, but because of the requirements of the plants it needs and the way we manage landscape to keep this species around. The etymology, just to start with, anthocharis comes from Greek anthos, flower, charis, beautiful or graceful or charm, according to the online definitions of that bit. The second word, the epithet of the binomial, cardamines, comes from the host plant association for the caterpillars. So Cardamines pratensis, you may know this as lady smock or the cuckoo flower. That's one of the two really key main food plants for the caterpillars. The other one is Jack by the Hedge or garlic mustard. This butterfly is really beautiful. The males have orange tips on their forewings. The females have black tips on the forewings. Both have mottled green undersides that kind of look like camouflage, or they look like the flower of a Jack by the Hedge flower. It's a kind of damp lover, really, the habitat it prefers. So it prefers damp meadows and hedgerows. Woodland edge is obviously quite dry, but in early spring, there's quite a lot of moisture still about before most of the deciduous trees come into leaf. It's also found in gardens, crucially. So what we do in gardens has a really important plant to play. The two main plants, although they're not the only ones, the cuckoo flower and garlic mustard, the orange tip female will lay eggs onto it, and then we need to allow those caterpillars to develop their full cycle to be able to pupate. Now, Matthew Oates, one of the UK and Ireland's leading butterfly experts, he was talking a few years ago about the fact that with climate change, they usually pupate in mid-July, but with climate change, it has been brought forward to mid-June in a hot, dry year. So it's hard to be sure when cutting back the vegetation might be possible, or that you don't interfere with the larval stage. So I would say give it a very wide berth, let the plants completely desiccate and dry out. If you have to cut them back at all, they start to look a little bit unsightly sometimes, especially garlic mustard. So it can be tempting in the garden to kind of cut them back early. But it's really important to let the caterpillars have their full time before pupating. So that's the bit I was really wanted to stress the importance of. And they do drink nectar from all sorts of other plants. So you might see them in spring on dandelions, forget-me-nots, bluebells, anything in flower really that's going to give them that nectar to keep them on the wing and energetic. But the plants that the caterpillars need, they're the really, really crucial bit. And we just need to give them a wide berth. I think more garlic mustard and cuckoo flower in gardens would be great. I think cuckoo flower is not easy where I live because it's such a damp lover. I'll try to go around the pond, but then people in a public garden will step on it because it's right near the edge. So it can be tricky, but if you've got a lawn that's damp enough to kind of house cuckoo flower, then please do cherish it, enjoy it, and leave it for the wildlife. And if you do see this amazing butterfly, the record is so valuable because it has diminished in some areas and it has proliferated in others in the last 30 years. So please record on iRecord and iNaturalist. Please take wonderful pictures. Everybody's got a camera phone now, so please take snaps of it if you can. And do tag me in, and I'd love to see where you've seen it.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.